A potential Biden administration is beginning to take shape, as are investigations into who would staff that administration. American Prospect managing editor Jonathan Geyer recently uncovered how members of Biden's foreign policy team have been cashing in on their access.
Yeah, really great story. The story of one Biden advisor's lucrative side hustle with Uber as well. So Jonathan joins us now via Skype to expand on all of this. Jonathan, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So, Jonathan, you did this deep dive piece, which I also covered here on Monday. Just lay it out for the audience. What are the connections that Biden's foreign policy team has to large defense contractors, major corporations in America, and what exactly are they up to before they're potentially coming into office?
So I spent about 2 months calling about everybody I knew in Washington, trying to figure out, what does West Exec Advisors do? Now, two of Biden's top advisors, Tony Blinken, a presumed Secretary of State or Chief of Staff, Michelle Flournoy, who would be Secretary of Defense, the first woman in that role, started this firm about 2 years ago. They work with a Google affiliate. They work with private equity and hedge funds and an Israeli AI company. Among other groups that strategic advisors, these kind of murky consultant groups work for, are Uber. And, this is a huge part of Washington that hasn't really been explored. And so I tried to take a deep dive and look at, why aren't we talking about the corporate interests of public servants?
And what are the policy implications, potentially, of some of the ties that you uncovered here?
Well, everyone says Biden's a foreign policy guy. And of course, he was brought on Barack Obama's ticket for that reason. But in fact, I would argue it's almost like a blank slate. He doesn't have any great accomplishments. He's in his late 70s, and he really values personal relationships. So here, also, his advisors are using their personal relationships to really make a buck while they're out of office. And this is what I want to look into. How would these corporate-minded folks influence a Biden foreign policy? Now, we might argue it's militaristic, it's focused on corporate interests. It doesn't reflect the kind of progressive or leftward push that is happening right now in the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan, tell me about just what you found in terms of their connections with the industry, many of these defense contractors. What is the foreign policy that they are pushing? And also, what is Biden's record on many of these things and his cozy relationship to these companies?
So many of these consultancies are a total black box in terms of clients. So we really don't know who they work for. Even after all of this research, I can only tell you about a couple of their clients. So it's a lot of guesswork, but we can see what folks say publicly when they talk about foreign policy interests, and it's quite militaristic. So it really raises questions about, are they being influenced by their clients? Now, a President Biden, that is still coming into fruition, what his foreign policy would look like. We know he would have a close relationship with someone like Bibi Netanyahu. That doesn't really reflect the progressive push within the party. So really, it's these personal relationships that Biden has had and developed over 3 or 4 decades that might have more cachet in his administration than actual policies.
That was one of the other interesting aspects of your reporting here, was basically the way that Biden has operated internationally. I mean, it kind of reminded me of the way that we think about Trump's foreign policy. It's all about like relationships and glad handing and like who you trust and who you have a close buddy-buddy feel for. And you basically argue that Biden has essentially taken that same personality-driven approach to foreign policy. Just elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, I think Biden is known and will often say he knows these leaders. I would make a big distinction with President Trump, who really has no idea what he's doing on foreign policy. What we're talking about with Biden is someone who's really using these personal relationships to advance really mainstream, really typical foreign policy ideas that are all too well known in Washington and frankly haven't worked. I mean, I remember when Vice President Biden was in Israel in 2010, Netanyahu announces a huge amount of settlements, and he's still 4 years later saying that Netanyahu is a buddy of his. So we're really talking about a status quo, not as destructive as a Trump foreign policy, but still, not going to make any massive changes. There's a whole industry of think tanks, research institutions, consultancies that are all banking on a return to normal in a Biden presidency, and that's really what these folks represent.
I'm really glad that you said that, because it's so important to understand kind of the think tank industrial complex in D.C. that also is very much intertwined with many of these defense contractors. Jonathan, can you lay out a little bit about what this means in practical terms for Iraq and Afghanistan, two of the most important measures? One of the better parts of your piece was actually just about Biden has a very strange record where he has showed restraint, but also backed the most disastrous leader in Iraqi history with Nouri al-Maliki, and has just showed terrible instincts in many cases. Can you lay into that a little bit?
Well, let me first say it's very common for research institutions in Washington to get a huge amount of defense funding. While Michelle Flournoy was running a think tank, it received at least $4 million worth of funding from defense contractors. It's hard to not say that this would influence ideas. Now, I don't want to get too deeply into Iraq and Afghanistan policy, but I would say this represents more of the same, staying the course. A lot of these questions where options are laid out that are just false choices in terms of how to go forward. So, if you look at think tank rosters, almost each and every folk who has a senior fellowship role often consults. They often have a side hustle. And this is what I was trying to shine a light on in this piece.
Yeah, well, people should go and read it. It's excellent. The reporting was fantastic. And it really gives you such a window into the way that this town operates and the way that it is likely to operate under a Biden administration. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. Great to have you.
Great job, Jonathan.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.